So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Luis Xavier Lopez-Farjeat to present the 8th lecture hosted by the Foundation for Philosophy and Sciences in Muslim Context. Luis is tenured professor at the Faculty of Philosophy at Universidad Panamericana, Mexico City. He writes on classical Islamic philosophy and is co-editor and co-author of the volume Philosophical Psychology in Arabic Thought and the Latin Aristotelianism of the 13th century, published in 2013, and of the Routledge Companion to Islamic Philosophy, published in 2016. In 2018, he published Razones, Argumentos y Creencias, Reflexiones a partir de la Filosofía Islámica, and in 2021, Routledge published his Classical Islamic Philosophy, a thematic introduction. It's a very, very interesting text. He is also a co-editor of the forthcoming volume, Pre-Modern Philosophy in Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin traditions, that will be published also by Routledge. He is associate professor, director of the Aquinas in the Arabs International Working Group, and editor of Topicus, Journal of Philosophy. And finally, he is a member of the Scientific Board of Journal of Philosophy in Sciences in Muslim Context. Today, Luis is going to deal with an amazing topic, humor and laughter in classical Islamic philosophy. Before giving him the floor, may I try to say some introductive words in Arabic to our audience in the Arab world. سيداتي سادتي، تحية طيبة، مساء الخير. سعيد جدا بأن أستقبل في هذه المحاضرة الثامنة الأستاذ لويس كزافييه لوبيز فرخات من مكسيكو سيتي، من جامعة بانامريكانا بمكسيكو سيتي. لويس فرخات معروف بكتاباته بخصوص الفلسفة العربية الإسلامية، فقد ألف وشارك في تأليف مقالات وكتب عدة، منها كتاب صادر عن روتلج، the Routledge Companion to Islamic Philosophy، أو دليل روتلج في الفلسفة الإسلامية. نشر أيضا عملا بالإسبانية حول الأسباب والحجج والمعتقدات، تأملات انطلاقا من الفلسفة الإسلامية. طبعا هذا الكتاب بالإسبانية صدر. أيضا روتليج نشرت له أيضا كتابا هاما عن الفلسفة الإسلامية الكلاسيكية، مدخل موضوعاتي. هو أيضا يشارك في الكتاب الجماعي قيد الصدور عن الفلسفة في التقاليد اليونانية والعبرانية والعربية واللاتينية، الذي ستنشره أيضا روتليج. هو أيضا مدير مشارك لفريق بحثي باسم The Aquinas، ثم الأكويني والعرب، وهو أيضا محرر أو رئيس تحرير مجلة توبيكوس، المجلة الفلسفية تصدر بمكسيكو سيتي، وهو أخيرا عضو الهيئة العلمية والاستشارية لمجلة الفلسفة والعلوم في السياقات الإسلامية. هذا كل ما يمكنني أن أقول بخصوص تقديم صديقنا لويس. أنا شخصيا سعيد بقبوله دعوة المؤسسة. So Luis, the floor is yours.
Shukran. Thank you very much, Fuad, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm happy to share these thoughts on humor and laughter in classical Islamic philosophy with you and the audience. So I'll proceed. So among the enormous list of topics studied by scholars working on classical Islamic philosophy, it is rather uncommon to find literature exploring the role of humor and laughter. There are some valuable materials exploring these two very human natural dispositions in Quranic studies, Islamic literature, and also among the vast research devoted to Kalam. In a long version of this lecture, a version that will be published in the Handbook for the Philosophy of Humor, first, I provide an overview of some relevant studies dealing with humor and laughter in the Quran and the Hadith materials. This approach provides the background for the second section, in which I explore two manifestations of humor, namely joking and laughter in Al-Ghazali. In the third section, I move on to a philosophical approach to the question. Today, I will only deal with the second and third parts. While it is evident that Al-Ghazali's views on humor and its manifestations are based on the religious doctrines contained in both the Quran and the Hadith materials, philosophers integrated Greek ethical ideas into their approaches to these matters and in general into their moral theories. Despite the fact that philosophers did not treat the various manifestations of humor systematically, in several works they expressed their views in this regard, usually in the context of ethical and educational discussions on the shaping of moral character, self-control, the psychology of emotions, and the moral role of poetry. As I will show, humor is closely related to the formation of character. As far as I know, this is the first time anyone tries to collect references on humor and its manifestations from the philosophical works of Al-Kindi, Abu Bakr al-Razi, Al-Farabi, the Syriac Christian Jacobite Yahya ibn Adi, Miskawaj, and Ibn Sina. I hope the reflections presented here spark discussion in a subject seldom approached in the scholarly literature. So I'll start with Al-Ghazali, some remarks on humor in Al-Ghazali. Humor and laughter are present in Kalam literature. As Eric Ormsby has said, I quote, "For philosophers, let alone theologians, humor is no laughing matter." He is thinking of Greek ancient philosophers like Democritus or Aristotle, and even of modern philosophers like Henri Bergson and his famous essay Laughter. Ormsby's article on strategies of humor in Al-Ghazali is particularly original. As is well known, Al-Ghazali is one of the most important theologians within Islamic tradition. He wrote a number of works on Kalam, Islamic ethics and jurisprudence, Sufi mysticism, and even treatises where he criticizes philosophy, debating mainly ideas of Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. The originality of Ormsby's approach comes from his analysis on the way in which Al-Ghazali incorporates humor as an argumentative strategy. I think that Al-Ghazali was not the first to notice the rhetorical effectiveness of humor in philosophical arguments. We could think of Socrates, Plato, or Aristophanes, and other comic poets who in some way address philosophical problems. But of course, this would be a matter of historical, literary, and philosophical debate. There are comedies, ironies, jokes that may be used philosophically. They require a sort of subtle intelligence to understand their sense, their message, and their effects. Humor and intelligence are, thus, not far from each other. Later philosophers such as Kierkegaard and Bergson were definitely aware of this. Ormsby affirms that long before Bergson, within the Islamic intellectual tradition, Al-Sijistani addressed laughter as related to intelligence. As Ormsby explains through the testimony of Al-Tawhidi, Al-Sijistani held that laughter occurs when our articulate reason collides with our innate animality. In other words, laughter simultaneously activates our intelligence, which strives to understand the joke, and our emotions, be it amusement, anger, or even relief. Ormsby examines Al-Ghazali appeal to intelligence through humorous stratagems. For instance, in one of his pivotal works, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, when Al-Ghazali is defending the denial of secondary causality and arguing for God's omnipotence, He recurs to hilarious examples as if he were caricaturizing his own position. Arguing that God is capable of everything, he holds that God could be even transform a boy into a dog or a book into a horse which has defiled the library with its urine and its dung. Definitely, Ormsby's approach to humor is suggestive and invites us to focus on details often unnoticed in Al-Ghazali's argumentation. Here, however, I shall take a different path. While Al-Ghazali resorts to some manifestations of humor, the way in which he condemns other manifestations such as laughing, joking, and mocking is noteworthy. These manifestations are the subject of moral concern. There are in the Quran positive and negative considerations of laughter, and in the Hadith materials, even God and the Prophet are said to laugh. It is thus impossible to condemn humor and laughter absolutely within Islam. This does not mean, however, that these manifestations should be given free rein, since they easily make people lose control of their passions and reason itself. In his masterpiece, The Revival of Religious Sciences, Ghazali condemns what he considers evils of the tongue. Joking is one of them. His starting point is a testimony by Al-Tirmidhi, who reports that the Prophet said, "Do not dispute with your brother, nor joke with him." The discussion starts by contrasting disputation with joking. Whereas the first causes harm, joking could consist in pleasing one's brother. Why is joking prohibited then? Al-Ghazali argues that joking itself is not prohibited, but excessiveness or regularity in joking. There is an interesting distinction here. Joking in itself is permissible, but what is prohibited is regularity in playing or joking. Al-Ghazali aims for moderation in joking, arguing that its excessiveness, I quote, leads to much laughter, which causes the heart to die, develops resentment in some cases, and removes reverence and respect, end of quote. Al-Ghazali constantly supports his views on the Hadith materials throughout the entire treatise. In this case, he evokes a hadith that says that the Prophet used to joke, but he always told the truth. Al-Ghazali's use of these passages is particularly interesting since he affirms that for ordinary people, it would not be easy to joke and tell the truth simultaneously. He says that when someone is trying to make others laugh, she often turns away from the truth. Al-Ghazali does not elaborate on this point here. However, in previous sections in which he deals with other evils of the tongue, such as engaging in falsehood, in disputation, in loud-mouthing, and in foul language, he constantly relates falsehood with ridicule and with the obscene. He argues, for instance, that engaging in falsehood involves backbiting, tail-bearing, and obscenity, and falsehood also involves forbidden things, religious innovations, and invalid opinions. He believes that the intention to make others laugh leads to what I would call verbal incontinence. It makes sense that Al-Ghazali associates with this garrulous behavior with evil and disrespect. After offering several narratives in support of this view, he says, I quote, "This is the evil of laughter. It is blameworthy to laugh so deeply and noisily, but one smile is praiseworthy, in which the teeth are uncovered but with no voice to be heard. This was the way the messenger of Allah, Allah's blessing and peace be upon him, used to laugh." End of quote. It is clear that a discreet smile and hoarse laugh are completely different. Al-Ghazali prefers a moderate smile. Among the different narratives that support his view, the most intriguing testimony is by Omar. "Do you know why joking, I quote, is called mizah? Because it removes the joker from the truth." Again, we find the very same idea that joking is incompatible with the truth. And Al-Ghazali adds, I quote, "It is said that everything has seeds, and the seed of enmity lies in mockery. It is also said that joking is to steal mind, cut off friends and companions." End of quote. In other words, joking leads to mockery, and mockery leads to discord. Although Al-Ghazali allows for innocent jokes that do not conflict with the truth, as the Prophet himself suggested, he insists that even these jokes should not be done regularly. Whoever persists in a lesser sin will sooner or later commit a grave sin. Again, Al-Ghazali suggests that moderation is the key to avoid evil behaviors. What keeps him from issuing a definitive condemnation of joking and laughter is the fact that, as several narratives report, the Prophet himself occasionally joked and had fun. Recall Al-Tirmidhi's testimony, I sometimes have fun with you. I do not say but what is true. In other narratives, he says that the Prophet joked the most with his wives and that he used to smile very often. In fact, Al-Ghazali collects anecdotes and testimonies that illustrate the Prophet's sense of humor. In all these examples, he plays and jokes with his friends, with women and children, exhibiting his graciousness. Al-Ghazali concludes that, as the behavior of the Prophet shows, there is pleasant fun that is permissible, but in rare cases and not regularly. After addressing the act of joking, Al-Ghazali deals with two other manifestations of humor which he describes as harmful, namely ridicule and mockery. Both are prohibited. This time he cites Quran 49:11. The passage commands believers not to mock others. In Al-Ghazali's own words, mockery leads to ridicule, contempt, scorn, and highlight one's defects and shortcomings in a way that causes the others to laugh at him. He then mentions different forms of mockery through the imitation of words and actions or by referring directly or indirectly to someone. He also brings up several hadith materials which disapprove mocking imitation. Earlier, Al-Ghazali condemned humorous stories that contain obscenity and falsehood. Although he admits that humorous stories in which there are no obscenities or falsehood are permitted, he maintains that the art of representing humorous stories, that is, satire, as a profession or custom is forbidden. The claim is interesting. Al-Ghazali seems to disapprove satire and certainly any kind of representation aimed at ridiculing others or even at ridiculing oneself. This could be confirmed through another reference against satire that appears in an earlier section devoted to singing and poetry. There, Al-Ghazali affirms that the Prophet said, I quote, "Verily, wisdom lies in some of the poetry, because it is true that the main purpose of poetry is eulogy, satire, or rhapsody, which may mix with lies and untrue speech." End of quote. Later, Al-Ghazali links satire and other manifestations of laughter with the causes of anger, which include haughtiness, arrogance, joking, humor, mockery, satire, putting to shame, disputation, opposition, treachery, and severe keenness on surplus wealth and majesty. As we can see, this list condemns manifestations and attitudes characterized by the fact that they harm others through laughter and ridicule to the point of make them angry. At the end of the section devoted to criticizing the ridicule and mockery, he mentions that these negative manifestations of humor can cause harm in many ways, by laughing at another's words when he is troubled, and sometimes at his deeds if they are distracted, like mocking his writings, profession, features, and so on, in case he is defective or suffers from any fault, like being short. Laughing at any of that belongs to the forbidden mockery. Note that laughing at all these things is precisely what satire does. This brings to mind one of the best-known satirists of the Islamic tradition, Al-Yahiz, the nickname he received for his protuberant eyes. His humorous works perfectly reflect what Al-Ghazali condemns here. A comparative study between them is, of course, outside of the scope of this presentation. Now let's move on to the philosophical approaches to humor and laughter. While the Kalam tradition based its moral views on religious texts, Islamic philosophers integrated Greek sources into their ethical theories, especially Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and in some cases adding a Hellenistic vein, Stoic, Epicurean, and perhaps Cynic, whose origin is not entirely clear. The fact that ethics was influenced by non-religious sources does not mean that philosophers were necessarily reacting against religion, as one might think. In fact, almost all of them were trying to harmonize Islam with Greek philosophy. The first philosopher to write a commentary on Aristotle's treatise was Al-Farabi. This commentary is no longer extant. However, another treatise by Al-Farabi, directing attention to the way to happiness, is inspired in some parts of the Nicomachean Ethics. As can be seen from Al-Farabi's ethical and political treatises, he was already completely immersed in Greek ethics. Still, there are references to Greek ethics in earlier and contemporary philosophers to Al-Farabi, such as Al-Kindi, Al-Razi, and Yahya ibn Adi. Before turning to Al-Farabi, I discussed the views of some of these philosophers. I shall not explain in detail the particular ways in which each philosopher understood ethics. Their approaches have in common the fact that they were concerned with providing a rational explanation for human action rather than conceiving an ethics derived exclusively from the religious law. Philosophical ethics is characterized by a constant insistence on the relevance of moderation and self-control. These notions are crucial to their approaches to humor and laughter. These philosophers assumed, as Aristotle did, that laughter was a proprium of human beings. Thus, laughter was considered natural to human beings and something that could be psychologically and physiologically explained. For instance, Al-Kindi formulates a definition of laughter in the following terms. Laughter is equilibrium of the blood of the heart in purity and gladness of the soul, to the point that its joy is made manifest. Its origin is in natural activity. As we can see, Al-Kindi understands laughter as something that involves both the body and the soul. In the passage above, he does not elaborate on whether the equilibrium of the blood of the heart causes laughter, or whether it is caused by gladness of the soul affecting also the body. Nevertheless, in one of his cosmological works on the proximate agent cause of generation and corruption, he holds that the actions of the soul follow the mixtures of bodily humors, and these mixtures vary according to the position of the celestial bodies. Al-Kindi states that moral character is affected by climate, which in turn is affected by the celestial bodies. This is why moral character varies from one region to another. According to Al-Kindi, in regions where the climate is hot and dry, people are dominated by their passions and desires. By contrast, in cold climates, we find the opposite. People have a balanced temperament, a moderate character, and great interest in theoretical research. If humoral mixtures affect our temperaments and character, we can infer that this influence includes our sense of humor or our inclination to sadness, as Al-Kindi explained in his letter on the method of how dispelling sorrows. In other words, the equilibrium needed for experiencing gladness or sadness would be a consequence of a humoral mixture. However, Al-Kindi holds that the soul is capable of achieving this balance or equilibrium. Despite the influence of celestial bodies and humoral mixtures in us, this does not imply that we are determined by our natural inclinations. According to Al-Kindi, these inclinations can be controlled and even suppressed through the acquisition of proper habits and virtues. In On Definitions and Descriptions of Things, he defines virtues as the mean for attaining an excellent character, and he makes a distinction between virtues which are generated in the soul, wisdom, courage, and temperance, and virtues generated by the effect of the soul among things that surround the body, justice, for instance. The soul may thus take control over the body. On the Doctrine of the Soul, a treatise which contains his most extensive explanation on the nature of the soul, he follows Plato distinguishing three parts of the soul, namely intellectual, irascible, and concupiscible. He points out that the intellectual part can work correctly only if it controls the other two parts, that is, the passions, the irascible part, and the sensual desires, the concupiscible part. Al-Kindi understands the soul as an incorporeal substance that is distinct from the body, but is accidentally bound up with the body. He argues that the distinction between body and soul is evident precisely because the soul opposes the affections of the body, for instance, desire and anger. The soul, in fact, needs to purify itself from the imperfections of the body. Hence, it makes sense that temperance is one of the virtues of the soul that helps control the passions and sensible desires, which are obviously related to the body. But in light of the tension between the intellectual part of the soul and the passions and desires, how should we understand Al-Kindi's brief definition of laughter? Al-Kindi does not distinguish between different kinds of laughter. In his definition, he identifies laughter with the gladness of the soul, making it equivalent to the equilibrium of the blood of the heart. In the sayings of Socrates, however, he attributes to Socrates the following statement, I quote, "The source for man's joy is a heart which has a moderate mixture, whereas the wellspring of the joy of the world is the just king. The source for man's sadness is a heart which has an imbalanced mixture, whereas the source of sadness for the world is the tyrannical king." End of quote. Temperance, a virtue of the soul, may be the cause of this balance. The contrast between joy as a moderate mixture and sadness as an unbalanced mixture coincides with the description he provides in the letter on the method of how dispelling sorrows. There, Al-Kindi defines sadness as a pain occurring in the soul because someone loses what she loves or she does not attain what she seeks. He then states that people who desire sensible possessions suffer from sadness. In order to dispel sadness, Al-Kindi recommends eradicating the desire for external possessions, practicing self-control, and devoting oneself to the intellectual life. Philosophy would be the real joy. Al-Kindi considers joy and sadness as opposites. Laughing is the manifestation of joy, and real joy requires self-control and reflection, which are necessary for attaining balance and equilibrium. Of course, we can assume that Al-Kindi knew that an intemperate laugh is possible, but we can infer that wise and temperate people do not lose control over themselves or laugh wildly. While there is not an explicit condemnation of laughter in Al-Kindi, he would evidently disapprove for excessive laughter. There are interesting connections between Al-Kindi's treatise and other ethical treatises in the very same context. The similarities between Al-Kindi and other philosophers focused on self-control may confirm that they were inclined to defend moderation in laughter. For example, in the Spiritual Medicine, Abu Bakr al-Arazi argues that rational beings most control their passions to attain self-control and equanimity. He does not develop a particular theory of humor and laughter, but like Al-Kindi, he holds that wise men must dispel sadness. Since in the entire treatise he disapproves pleasure in excess, we can infer that the philosophical way of life consists in turning away from sadness without necessarily leaning towards a dissolute life. His position is interesting. While some passions such as sadness should be suppressed, others such as laughter should be moderated. Of course, this is an inference based on al-Arazi's disapproval of sadness, one that deserves further attention and discussion. Although he was not a Muslim, I want to pay special attention to Yahya ibn Adi. The Christian Jacobite and student of Al-Farabi's wrote his treatise The Reformation of Morals in an Islamic context. In fact, over the centuries, it was attributed to other Islamic scholars. Its content reflects topics of common interest for Muslims and Christians, among them the idea of virtue as the proper way to happiness. Yahya ibn Adi talks about moral qualities as states of the soul. These qualities or habits could be good or bad, natural or acquired, and one should behave according to the good ones, that is, virtues, avoiding the evil one, vices. Yahya adopts the Platonic tripartite view of the soul, according to which the intellectual part or faculty controls the other two parts or faculties, the concupiscible and the irascible. He then presents a list of 20 virtues and 20 vices that he carefully expounds, highlighting the necessity of taking control over oneself if one is really committed to attaining the virtues and eradicating the vices. In his defense of virtue, he repeatedly disapproves of manifestations of humor, especially joking. He criticizes those who are slaves of pleasures and bodily appetites and sees them as becoming more like animals than human beings. They avoid gathering with virtuous people and prefer the company of the foolish. They allow joking and amusement to take control of them. One requires self-control to prevent pleasures and appetites from taking over. Yahya ibn Adi defines this virtue of self-control as guarding against carelessness. He adds that the virtue guards precisely against repugnant joking, against keeping company with those who engage in it, and against frequenting their company. It is restraining the tongue from lewdness and from obscene, hilarious, and foolish speech, especially in the assemblies and gatherings of decent people. One who goes to excess in joking and acts in a lewd manner has nothing to be proud of. Profligacy is the opposite to self-control. As Yahya himself explains, this vice consists in the abandonment of restraint. Hence, profligates constantly are engaging in joking and amusements associated with foolish people, attending sessions of nonsense, banter, and lewdness. It is uttering obscenities, repeating inconsequential things, and jesting. Yahya's treatise is an exhortation to reform morals by practicing virtues containing the irascible soul, controlling the concupiscible soul, and strengthening the rational soul. In order to subjugate the appetites, Yahya indicates that one should frequent the company of ascetics, monks, hermits, scholars, and other people characterized by their virtuous way of life focused on abstinence, chastity, and studiousness. And again, he instructs his readers to avoid gathering with foolish and dissolute people and with those who are constantly joking and playing. The reformation of morals is not exactly a religious treatise, but contains a strict moral program in which the manifestations of humor are seen as something vain and proper to those who lack self-control. The invitation to frequent ascetics implies that they are a good example that one should imitate. It could thus be interpreted as an invitation to subjugate or even to suppress certain negative attitudes such as joking. This is in contrast to Al-Arazi's views in the philosophic life, where he argues that asceticism is not an adequate way of life since it is a form of excess. Virtuous people exercise self-control, thus avoiding any kind of excess. This is an interesting approach that places Al-Arazi's very close to Epicureanism. But Yahya's approach contrasts not only with Al-Arazi's, but also with Al-Farabi's, who understood individual ethics as connected with the political life. Al-Farabi's main concern was not our personal moral character, but the political life. Thus, virtues as a result of moral habits are mostly preparatory for the political life. In directing attention to the way to happiness, Al-Farabi explains that human natural dispositions need to be shaped to encourage noble actions and develop the capacity to discern and recognize that which is noble, good, and virtuous. This stage can only be attained through the acquisition of moral habits. Like Aristotle, Al-Farabi understands habits as the repetition of an action for successive periods. Good habits engender virtues, while bad habits engender vices. Again, he adopts Aristotle's doctrine of the mean and explains that actions ought to be balanced and lean neither toward excess nor toward efficiency. He provides then several examples of these balanced actions or dispositions, explaining the moral habits that result from them. For instance, courage is a moral habit that arises when one achieves the mean between temerity and cowardice. Generosity is the mean between saving and spending wealth. Self-control is the mean between avidity and etc. Among these examples, Al-Farabi includes sarf, that is, the equivalent to the Greek eutrapelia, understood by Aristotle as the mean between boorishness and buffoonery. The Arabic sarf may be translated as gracefulness, elegance, and even sense of humor. McGuinness and Reisman translate it as urbanity. There is a passage where Al-Farabi defines sarf. Urbanity, I quote, which is a noble disposition, is produced by a median state in the use of humor. People are in need of relaxation in their lives, and relaxation always only tends toward anything that, even when done excessively, is a source of pleasure, or at least not a source of pain. And humor is one of those things that, even when engaged in often, is a source of pleasure, or at least not a source of pain. However, a median use of humor produces urbanity, whereas too much humor produces buffoonery, while too little produces boorishness. Humor includes whatever a person says, does, and uses. A median use of it is appropriate for a noble, free, and unburdened man to say and hear. This book will by no means take on the task of defining these things thoroughly, since they have been treated fully elsewhere. End of quote. This passage strongly resembles Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics 4:8. The point in both passages, Aristotle's and Al-Farabi's, is that eutrapelia, or sarf, is a virtue consisting of the standard of good taste, necessary for social behavior. Like Al-Farabi, Aristotle identifies laughter as an expression of this sort of sense of humor, and explains that people who carry humor to an excess are considered vulgar buffoons, while those who never say anything funny and take offense at those who make jokes are considered boorish or unpolished. According to these passages, there are tasteful jokes which are proper to noble, free, and educated persons. Uneducated people strive to be humorous at all costs and jest insolently and even abusively. Al-Farabi mentions that he has treated these matters elsewhere, perhaps referring to his lost commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics. An interesting approach to Al-Farabi's conception of sarf as this sort of good taste or sense of humor would be to inquire to what extent this notion could be related to his understanding of poetry, particularly with humorous poetry. In several places within his works, Al-Farabi explains poetry as a logical art with a moral educational role. Put briefly, the aim of poetry is persuasion by means of pleasant images. There is poetry that promotes virtue and poetry that promotes vice. One could think that Al-Farabi has in mind the Arabic adab. Nevertheless, in his canons of poetry, he explains Greek genres. Islamic thinkers did not clearly understand Greek poetic genres. They had a vague idea, but they were not familiar with theatrical representations. Already in the earliest translation of Aristotle's Poetics from Syriac into Arabic, Abu Bishr Mata replaced tragedy with panegyric or eulogy and comedy with satire. It is highly probable that Al-Farabi was familiar with Mata's translation when he wrote his canons. Nevertheless, unlike Mata, but like Ibn Sina later on, he had no contact with Greek genres but kept the Greek terminology. The Canons is not exactly a commentary on Aristotle's Poetics, but Al-Farabi has concerns similar to those of Aristotle, namely the definition of poetical statements according to their matters and contents. His account of Greek genres, however, goes beyond Aristotle's. He mentions tragedy, which he understands as a mortuary poem, dithyramb, comedy, iambos, drama, ainos, diagramma, satiric, poemata, epic, rhetoric, amphigeneseos, and acoustic. Here, I only refer to his brief definitions of comedy and satire. Perhaps having in mind Aristotle's statement that comedy represents people as worse than they are, Al-Farabi explains that comedy mentions evil things, censorable characteristics, reprehensible habits, and personal satires. While comedy is characterized as poetry with a particular meter, satire is associated with musicians whose aim was to contrive astonishing movements similar to those of wild beasts and animals. Al-Farabi does not elaborate on whether these genders should be forbidden because they present reprehensible behaviors. Given his Aristotelian theory of virtue, I suspect that Al-Farabi would say that as long as they are not vulgar and obscene, carefully selected comic and satiric stories may be acceptable. Islamic philosophers agree on the educational role of poetry in the refinement of character, a treatise which is firmly rooted in Greek ethical theories but adapted to Islamic values. Miscawaj states that children must learn by heart the traditions and poems that confirm the good manners in which they have been educated. Moreover, due to its corrupting influence on young people, frivolous poetry should be avoided, even though it sometimes tries to give the impression that it is refined. Miscawaj may be referring to satire, among other kind of poems. The aim of Miscawaj's treatise is to teach how to acquire a character such that actions may be right and performed with ease. Within his ethical treatise, he constantly refers to self-control, and despite the fact that Miscawaj recommends staying away from frivolities, he does not completely disdain having a sense of humor. When he establishes friendship as one of the necessary conditions for achieving happiness, he explains that virtuous friendship may include pleasant fun, agreeable conversation, exchange of jokes, and the pursuit of pleasures permitted by the law and determined by reason without going beyond these pleasures to excessive indulgence or, on the other hand, scorning them and abstaining from them. It seems that Miscawaj is describing something similar to the Aristotelian eutrapelia. My suspicion may be confirmed by what he mentions next. He explains that we should avoid carrying on the social pleasures to the extreme. If the extreme is excess, we could fall into frivolity, depravity, and dissoluteness, and other reprehensible behaviors. If the extreme is deficiency, we could fall into stupidity, sternness, peevishness. In Open Questions and Explicit Answer, also known as the Philosopher Response, Al-Tawhiri asks a series of questions to Miscawaj on a vast array of subjects. The conversation between these two scholars includes interesting remarks on laughter. Why do some people willingly become the target of other people's jokes? Why do we laugh harder when someone keeps a straight face, etc.? Here I shall mention a brief passage that confirms Miscawaj's approval of laughter and humor. In one of Al-Tawhiri's many questions, Miscawaj makes a distinction between to jest and to joke. He explains that speaking in jest is the opposite of speaking in earnest. Speaking in jest is regarded with disapproval, while joking is not disapproved. He evokes a hadith I mentioned earlier, in which the Prophet used to joke, and he would speak nothing but the truth. According to Miscawaj, this means that the Prophet joked, but he never jested. He concludes by saying that there is a positive sense of humor, namely joking, as distinct from jesting, which is reprehensible. The nuance is relevant and categorizes humor as something positive. Moving on to slightly different perspective, Ibn Sina addresses laughter very briefly in the context of his psychology. In the part devoted to On the Soul in his encyclopedic work, The Healing, he explains that the faculties of the soul are divided into practical and theoretical. In On the Soul 1.5, he elaborates on what he calls the practical intellect, defining it as the faculty, quote, that is a principle that moves the human body to perform particular actions determined by reflecting on what is required by customary opinions specific to those actions, end of quote. He then explains the practical intellect's role in relation to the appetitive faculty, the imaginative and stimative faculties, and in relation to the intellect itself. Here, I only want to draw attention to the fact that in this passage, Ibn Sina connects the practical intellect to emotional reactions. I quote, in relation to the appetitive faculty of the animal soul, it is the aspect as a result of which certain states specific to humans come about in them by which they are quickly disposed to act or to be affected. For example, shame, timidity, laughing, weeping, etc. Simply put, emotional reactions, laughter for instance, dispose human beings to certain kinds of action. This brief passage is key for understanding Ibn Sina's conception of poetry. Influenced by Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina embraces in his Poetics of the Healing the same kinds of genres I mentioned earlier, among them comedy and satire. Like Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina places poetry as the fifth logical art after demonstration, dialectic, sophistic, and rhetoric. Poetry is defined as an imaginative speech in which the soul yields accepting or rejecting matters without deliberation, cogitation, or choice. In sum, the soul is affected psychologically or emotionally rather than rationally. Poetry affects the soul, moving it towards actions and emotions. According to Ibn Sina, poetry may cause some sort of assent, tasdik, but not the same kind of assent as logical demonstration. While in logical or philosophical demonstrations, assent is due to the fact that the thing is what it is said to be, in the case of imaginative speech, assent is due to wonder and pleasure. Ibn Sina's Poetics addresses many interesting topics that deserve further discussion. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I shall focus on his remarks related to humor, beginning with his definition of comedy and satire. Both definitions are close to Al-Farabi since he's following the same account of Greek genres. Comedy portrays evils and vices and sometimes ugly traits common to animals and human beings. Satire was conceived by musicians to induce violent animal movements. Ibn Sina adds that comedy imitates that which is very base and immoral and is intended to ridicule and mock. He explicitly says that comedy is a species of the ridiculous. Comedy is an account of meanness and a propensity for the despicable without anger accompanying it or physical pain occurring to the imitated. He also observes that in order to emphasize these moral qualities, comedians wear a mask that conveys these attributes: ugliness, bad temper, and a facial expression free from any grief, instead exhibiting gayness and merriness. This description is quite revealing of Ibn Sina's view of humor. Like other philosophers of his tradition, he identifies comedy with the imitation of shameful moral qualities. For this reason, he holds that comedy is not a thing that requires the care of serious, virtuous, and knowledgeable men. He contrasts comedy with tragedy, which is understood as representing the perfect virtue. In sum, given that poetry affects the soul, causing emotional reactions and assent, we should be careful with comedy as it represents the despicable and thus someone may be persuaded by its representation. Like other poetic genres, however, comedy has a particular structure and may be a source of wonder and pleasure. Thus, Ibn Sina may be separating the aesthetics of the poem from its moral quality. This separation seems improbable, however. In Poetics 4.2, Ibn Sina explains that the aim of rhetoric is to persuade through eloquent speeches, while poetry persuades by representing habits and moral character. Ibn Sina is concerned with the educational and social character of poetry. Thus, although in his Poetics there is not an explicit condemnation of humorous representations, there are reasons to suspect that he would have remained suspicious of them. As we can see, there are several passages in which Islamic philosophers address humor and its manifestations. As I have shown, their approaches to these subjects usually appears in treatises related to ethics or in works concerned with education. Here I have provided a preliminary survey of various philosophical works where I have found interesting reflections on humor and laughter. It is my hope that these notes incite among scholars further discussion on the matter. So in conclusion, humor and its various manifestations have been approached from different perspectives within the Islamic tradition. I have shown how the religious sources themselves, the Quran and the Hadith materials, contain exegetical challenges. Here, I have focused mainly on Al-Ghazali in order to exemplify the moral concerns of classical kalam surrounding laughter, joke, mockery, and related manifestations of humor. Among philosophical approaches to this phenomena, I have pointed out that there is present in all cases a moral concern for the formation of virtuous character. Although theologians and philosophers built their ethical and moral views on different sources, they shared common interests. They promote self-control, moderation, and cautious attitude towards humorous representations and poetry. Islamic philosophers inherited from their Greek sources, especially from Plato, a critical approach towards laughter as a dangerous emotion that could jeopardize self-control. For this reason, they saw comic poetry and humorous representations as a moral threat. At the same time, based on a particular blend of Aristotelian ethics with Platonic, Hellenistic, and Islamic views, they argued for moderation and against the extremes of humor. The suppression of humor leads us to boorishness and even sadness, while laughing excessively makes us buffoons. These philosophers prescribed a balanced temperament and a moderate character. In this regard, there is an interesting contrast between them and the Christian views as they appear in Yahya ibn Adi's treatise. While Yahya shared similar concerns with the other philosophers, he expressed sympathy with the exemplary life of ascetics. Some Muslims also sympathize with the ascetics, but this was not the case of the philosophers. In my view, ascetics tend to suppress strong emotions and tendencies, including laughter. By contrast, Islamic philosophers understood humor and laughter as a natural part of our emotional disposition, and thus as something that cannot be suppressed, although it can be moderated. In their attempts to moderate humor, all of them pursued self-control and restraint, providing interesting insights of, for instance, Al-Kindi's point on the dispelling of sorrows, Al-Razi's disapproval of ascetics, Al-Farabi's notion of sarf as a sort of sense of humor, Miskawa's philological explorations, and even Sina's concern of the moral qualities of poetry. Whether all these philosophers were able to overcome the curious tension between seriousness and humor is a matter deserving of further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Luis, for this philosophical journey. A very interesting lecture. Now it's time. We have some time to discuss your lecture. But let me ask you, a very preliminary question. Why did you ignore Ibn Rushd? It's a naive question. I know that his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics is not, available in English. It's only available in Hebrew. But we have some. We have another alternative. His commentary on Aristotle's Poetics. So why did you ignore? I know also he's very serious.
No, yes, of course. No. In fact, I didn't include Ibn Rushd because I wanted to expand. I didn't want to expand the paper, but you are completely right. I know the commentary in the Poetics, and of course there he provides a definition of tragedy, and of course he has as far as I remember, his treatment of poetry is quite similar to the one we find in Al-Farabi, and I think it happens the same. It's not very clear whether he condemned comedy, but of course he also have this moral approach that we can even find in the Republic, in the commentary on the Republic.
Yes.
So yes, that would be a very nice idea. But I think that we would find a very interesting approach, and that's interesting because we usually think of Ibn Rushd as an Aristotelian. And in this regard, I think he's more Platonic. He has this educational concern, and he thinks that comedy is linked with vices and with bad behavior. And I think he thinks that we should control that comedy comic representations. Well, in the Republic, that's clear. As you remember, he presents his own catalog in the same fashion as Plato does in the Republic, and it's interesting that he adds some Muslim jokes or Muslim representations that he thinks are not correct because they incite bad moral behavior. So thank you. Yes, perhaps in an expanded version, of course, I would love to include Ibn Rushd. That would be great.
Okay, thank you so much. It's open. Richard, Muqdad, and Daniela, in case you have questions, please, Richard.
We can't hear you.
I know. I enjoyed this very much. It's I found it a very humorous treatment. Very serious treatment of a humorous topic. But this is I've never gotten into these passages. It's really quite interesting. I don't have anything to contribute, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I enjoyed it very much, but I did not laugh out loud. I did not do a horse laugh.
That's good. That's good.
Wow, wait.
Okay, what about Muqdad? In case you have any question, Muqdad, just put on your microphone, please. Your microphone, please. Yes, good. Please.
J'ai pas quelque chose à remarquer. J'ai beaucoup aimé. J'ai apprécié. Je voulais seulement dire que non, j'ai pas des choses à ajouter, mais si je peux parler en français.
Oui, bien sûr, vas-y.
Non, moi j'ai pensé aux moqueries des philosophes, des autres. C'est-à-dire quand le philosophe veut faire rire tellement, il montre que le topo de l'adversaire est tellement ridicule qu'on pourrait en rire. Non, je pense à Razel.
Yes.
Je pense à Razel et les choses comme ça. Quand il dit lorsque l'argument est tellement ridicule et si quelqu'un le lisait, on croirait qu'il est qu'il a l'humeur mal tournée ou qu'il est.
Oui. C'était à Tahafut al-Falasifa concernant les arguments cosmologiques des philosophes. In case. Yes. In case, I mean, when reading this cosmological arguments written by some philosophers concerning, the heaven, you might feel that they are, mere science of bad humor. They are just let's say the signals of bad humor, and or let's say that it means that they are sick. So which means that what they said or they uttered is just hilarious or something like that. It's absurdities, not something serious. That's the exactly at least what Muqdad wants to say as a comment on your lecture. Yeah, go ahead, please.
No. So if I understood well, so he's referring to this relation between the heavens, the sphere, and the effect they have upon the people. Yes, of course. I know it sounds a little bit odd, but at the same time, I think it's interesting because the heavens affected the weather and affected the environment, and that was in Al-Kindi. And Al-Kindi, perhaps it's not the only one who has this kind of approaches. We can find it also in the Greek tradition. Hippocrates and the medical tradition had similar thoughts regarding the effect, and even Aristotle, the effect of the heavenly spheres upon human temperaments. And
that's exactly what Ibn Rushd refuted in his commentary on Ibn Sina's medical poem. Also, his disciple Ibn Tumlus refuted that. It's not nonsense to make these links between something from heaven and the humor on the ground.
Yeah, but I know, but at the same time, I found it interesting because there is a relation that happens more in the biological realm. I mean, as you find in Al-Farabi, the heavenly spheres affect the humus, the vegetation, the animals, etc. And that's what we eat, and of course what we eat affect the quality of the semen, and that affect the temperament of human beings. So I think that if we only read the relation between the heavenly spheres upon human beings without considering the biological aspects that are involved there, I think that of course Ibn Rushd is right. But I think that we should need to explore what is going on in the biological realm when philosophers think that the heavenly spheres affect the human condition.
Richard.
Luis, this is very interesting, but I was just thinking of something else as well. And I was thinking of children.
Right.
And the laughing of children. Laughing and laughing in play as well, just a pure expression of joy. So that's a different perspective. That is laughing out of joy. And I don't think you addressed that, did you?
No, you're right. I didn't find in the passages in the Islamic passages references to children, but I have to confess that I've been working these topics in another philosophers, Greek and even Christian fathers of the church, and I was thinking if I am right that in fathers of the church, as Clement, for instance, there are distinctions between several kinds of laughter, and of course there is an innocent laughter that happens in the case of the children. But you are right. In Islamic philosophers and even in Al-Ghazali, I didn't find references to the kind of children. But maybe one could think that in these hadith materials where it is said that the Prophet used to laugh with women and children, there is a reference there that perhaps it's that kind of very innocent laughter, and when people display, when children are playing and having fun with their friends and with their parents and even with the Prophet. But that would be a very innocent kind of laughter that would not be condemned.
Well, there's another thing as well. I was just thinking for a moment of the laughter involved in physical tickling.
Yeah.
It's usually children, but adults have that too, to some extent too. So it's
and that
doesn't involve any kind of mockery or anything of that sort.
Yeah, of course. And what you're saying, it's very interesting, but because that would lead to another part of the discussion that would consist on whether laughter is always voluntary or is involuntary. And that's interesting. In the case that you are saying, perhaps it's not a voluntary laughter. So in that case, we would not have any moral concern. But that's a huge discussion whether this is a voluntary or involuntary reaction. Because it seems that it's voluntary, then it's part of the moral concern, and if it is involuntary, it seems that it is part of our natural disposition, and we are animals that used to laugh, reacting to some kind of physical stimulus or perhaps to particular situations.
Yeah. There's another, small, even when reading Al-Ghazali's criticism, we might find some, let's say, mockery. I mean, towards philosophers.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, what do you think about? I mean, this. I mean, talking religious. It's not. I mean, from a religious perspective, it's not allowed to do that.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because I think that sometimes Al-Ghazali, when he's following the Hadith materials, he finds there a sort of ambivalence, because the Hadith materials itself, we have some materials that condemned laughter, and of course they condemn because it's a negative, as I mentioned, there a negative attitude towards other people. But there are also some materials that accept that sometimes Muslims can laugh against infidel people and against unbelievers. So sometimes I think that in Al-Ghazali one can find this kind of ambivalence, that in some cases perhaps mockery to others is not a very bad attitude.
Yes. Muqaddad, please.
Oui, non, c'est-à-dire celui qui plaisantait le plus, je pense, c'était Avicenne, Ibn Sina,
Ouais.
qui arrivait à dire même des obscénités qu'on ne peut pas dire. Donc, c'est tellement obscène que quand il parle de race et quand il parle de...
Ouais.
C'est très dur pour se moquer. Non, mais pour revenir un peu à Zeli, est-ce qu'il parlait du rire, est-ce que c'est en tant que théologien? Est-ce qu'il a parlé dans Ahya Ulumuddin? Est-ce qu'il traitait du rire comme problème? Je ne sais pas si ça l'intéresse en tant que théologien, ou beaucoup plus un livre dans les profondeurs psychologiques de l'âme humaine, comme font les mystiques, c'est-à-dire beaucoup plus qu'un théologien. C'est-à-dire comment mettre le propos de Ghazali sur le rire.
Should I try to translate, or
yes?
I mean,
yes.
The question about, I mean, the Ghazalian or the Ghazalian sources. I mean, what about the presence of laughter and humor in his book Ihya Ulumuddin, or what we call the revival of? That's it. That's the. What do you think about it?
Well, that's the source I refer to, where I mentioned that he speaks about the evils of the tongue, and he considers that just joking, mockery are evils of the tongue. And what I have found very interesting there is this reference I made to satire and comedy, and I don't know if you remember that I mentioned that it seems that he understands that comedy and especially satire has to do with representation. So I have always found very curious, as I mentioned, that these mutakalimun and philosophers were not very familiar to theatrical representations, and there is a passage there where he seems that he's aware that satire is a representation. And I found that very, very, very interesting. But you can find there, of course, the moral approach. He talks about evils of the tongue, and jokes are evil, isn't it?
Just a small question. What do you think? I mean, was there any kind of influence of hadith tradition, Quranic statement on the philosophical approach? Because I noticed that you started with this material, and then you moved to the philosophical approach. What do you think about the bridges?
Yeah. Well, in the complete paper, I skipped the first part, that is focused on Quran and Hadith materials, and in the philosophers, with the exception of the reference I made to Miskawash that refers to a Hadith, in the rest of the philosophers, I didn't find references to the Hadith materials, but only Miskawash. It's the only one that quotes that very interesting passages that seems that the Prophet thought that those who make jokes engaged with falsehood, and it's a very curious opposition there, isn't it? Jokes and the truth are opposed, and I think that should be explored in more detail. That's an interesting opposition. Yeah,
sure. So, okay, so Muqdad, please.
Qu'est-ce qu'on racontait sur le Farabi là, quand il maîtrisait la musique, les instruments, si bien qu'il peut jouer, faire pleurer, faire rire, faire dormir? Est-ce que c'est ça qui est de sérieux?
Est-ce que tu peux répéter, s'il te plaît, pour que je peux traduire ça?
Dans la biographie de Farabi, je ne sais pas qui alors, mais parler de Farabi, il maîtrisait tellement, l'auteur de musique, maîtrisait tellement le jeu d'instruments qu'il pouvait faire dormir les gens, faire rire les gens, faire pleurer aussi. Je ne sais pas à quel point c'est sérieux.
Muqdad mentioned the fact that Al-Farabi was a master in music. So
and there's that story that it's related with emotional reactions, isn't it, in the biography, that he made people laugh and then he made people cry and then he put people to sleep. But that's again interesting because that has to do again. Well, if that story is true, that is also related to what I was mentioning to Richard. That it seems that there is something involuntary there. That it seems that we can react to some external stimulus, laughing or crying, and it has nothing to do with a bad intention. You see.
Ok.
Ultime question. Est-ce que ce livre du rire attribué à Aristote, connaît-il?
Sorry?
Le livre sur le rire d'Aristote.
Oui.
Qui avait une grande histoire chez les médiévaux. Est-ce qu'il y avait un livre sur le rire? On lui a fait un livre sur le rire.
I mean, the question is about Aristotle's. I mean, we used to attribute a book, to Aristotle on laughing. I mean, I don't know. The question is whether it's authentic or not. I mean,
you mean the second book? The idea that there is a second book of the Poetics that it concerns with poetry, with comedy, isn't it?
Maybe
you mean that?
Not sure.
Yeah, because there's this story that perhaps there is a second part of the Poetics that is lost and is related to comedy, and but we have no idea. I think there are a couple of scholars there who have worked on the reconstruction of that book, but I think we don't have too many references. Well, at least as I know, maybe some passages from the Rhetoric. I don't know, but I don't know, or perhaps it's a reconstruction that one can do, taking into consideration what he did with tragedy. But I think that kind of reconstruction would be very imprecise.
Okay. There is another question from a lady, Madeleine Wise. She says, I know this largely falls outside of the scope of the talk, but could you talk a little more about how you see Al-Jahid fitting into this conversation? الجاحظ, one of the متكلمين and معتزلة متكلم.
That I mentioned very briefly, who is the author of several satires. Well, of course, he will be the precise example of the existing of comedy in the Muslim tradition, isn't it? And I mentioned very briefly that it's interesting that what Al-Ghazali criticizes is exactly the kind of mockery we find in the comic works of Al-Jahiz. So I want to work on that in more detail, because I think it's interesting the kind of social portrait in the works of Al-Jahiz, the kind of how do you say, the kind of works that he's pointing out, that he's mocking, even the philosophers, well, the scholars, the mutakallimun. So he used to laugh a lot of many people there. But that's something that I want to work in more detail. But of course, it's very relevant because it's exactly the opposed approach to the one I mentioned here. Because as you saw, I was more focused on the moral idea of this kind of the moral approach to humor and laughter, and we find this tendency to condemn, or at least to be cautious about how to treat these comic representations. And Al-Jahiz would represent the contrary. But there is also something interesting there, that perhaps it represents the contrary, but to some extent is an example that comedy could also help to or also contribute to our moral education. So comedy would have also an educational role.
Good. So thank you so much. Let's end this, nice and interesting conversation. I would like to thank you a lot, Luis, for this very interesting lecture. Thank you, Muqdad, for your contribution. Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. See you maybe in Paris in August.
Excellent.
Inshallah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, for the talk, for the conversation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.